Thank you. I want to give you this, this lecture, I hope, is actually not going to be too confusing for you, because there are some very confusing elements to the chronology of Megiddo. It's one of the great big digs of the Oriental Institute from the 20s and 30s in Palestine. It was part of the British Mandate in the 1920s and 30s in Palestine, and now, of course, it's in modern Israel today. And as part of those excavations, it was really they were really trying to uncover not only the biblical history, but trying to understand a complete picture of the evolution of this particular mound. And the site is very, not particularly large, and there was a very ambitious program. James Henry Breasted tried to institute a program to excavate this mound entirely from top to bottom, and this, of course, was completely impossible to do, as the excavators found, to their frustration. So this talk is really more about Megiddo than the Megiddo Gallery, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert the objects that are in the galleries to help you to have a better understanding of their place within the historical and archaeological narrative. Okay, so Tel Megiddo, that's to give its name today in Israel. Tel with the single L is the typical way you spell Tel in Hebrew, and but in Arabic it's Tel el Mutasalim, which means the mound of the governor. And this is an Ottoman. It goes back to the Ottoman times, which point it would have been the property of the local vilayet or mayor under the Ottoman Empire. But of course, we also know it as biblical Armageddon in the book of Revelations. It's it's Har Megiddo, which means the mound of Megiddo, and this translates effectively into Armageddon, which is the place where, in the book of Revelations, where the confrontation of the great battle between good and evil, effectively the last battle, will take place. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. But just to give you its sense of topography here, Megiddo is it's about 15 acres. It's about 6 hectares in area. That's not actually that large. You can see that it's this sort of conical shape, and it's got these large bits that are coming off the end. They're actually part of that is part of the stuff that's coming off the sides of this is actually modern dumps from the excavations going way back. And you can see also, I want you to take notice of this great big trench right through the middle here. And this I'll be showing you that again in a minute. You can see in the background, I think this is a view towards the sort of northwest here, and so further on into the distance there, you would eventually hit the coast, and it's situated in a central valley. And this central valley, the Jezreel Valley, is very strategically important. It's one of the reasons why it's one of these places of warfare and battles. It's also situated, I'll just show you, there's Megiddo there. So you can see how it's the Jezreel Valley. It's a bit like a kind of triangle shape with its widest end on the coast. And here you have it goes. There's the Carmel Range, which is a very it's a hilly outcrop that stretches right along here, and this is very difficult to pass. So you need there are a number of passes, and one of the important passes is the Wadi Ara, which is very strategically important, which connects the Jezreel Valley with the plain down here, which extends then onto the route down to Egypt. So very strategically important in terms of its route. So it's really at the crossroads, and there are some very famous battles that took place at Megiddo, and probably the most famous one is the Battle of Megiddo in around 1479 BC. Now, that date is sometimes referred to differently depending on how you date the reign of Thutmose III, but it was within the reign of Thutmose III And if you haven't read this book, I really strongly recommend that you read this book, which is called The Battles of Armageddon by Cline, who's also one of the co-directors of the Megiddo expedition right now. And it's really an excellent book, and it really outlines the historical relevance of this particular region in terms of as a place of battle. So in this period, we'll move on to Thutmose III and some of the implications of that battle. But also it was a place where Pharaoh Necho of Egypt defeated the king of Israel, Josiah in 609 BC, and also later on in the Crusader period there were battles nearby, and also even in the First World War, General Allenby defeated the Ottoman Turkish forces there in 1918. So it seems to have been a flashpoint, and you can see why this is its location here. So you've got the Wadi Ara here. And this was the route that the Thutmose III brought his army through. And this really allowed him to have the element of surprise in that battle, because the troops of the forces that were opposing, the conspiring forces against Egypt, were gathered at places like Tanakh and in other places in the Jezreel Valley, leaving Megiddo relatively undefended. So Thutmose III had that element of surprise. But it's a very, very important route in terms of getting from Egypt overland, up the Via Maris, and then up towards Syria, and eventually to Mesopotamia, to the Euphrates. And so it was important on the caravan route, which is another reason why Megiddo is so important. The excavation history of Megiddo is very long. It's over a century now. So the first excavations took place by Gottlieb Schumacher, who was actually an American citizen, but also of German origin. And he went there in the early part of the 20th century, 1903 to 1905, and excavated Megiddo. And he was responsible for the huge trench that we have right through the middle of Megiddo at its west and east sides. And really, this was a very common form of excavation in those particular days. They were really interested in getting right down to the biblical levels, and that also meant getting a sense of the history of that site through getting these very big cross sections. So it was quite damaging to the site, but of course he did make some important discoveries. But it really wasn't until the 1920s and 1930s that the Oriental Institute took charge to excavate the mound at Megiddo. And it was excavated by a series of directors. So starting with Clarence Fisher, he had already excavated at Beth Shan, just not too far away, so he seemed like a natural choice for this particular expedition. But he suffered from ill health and had to retire from the expedition. Then PLO Guy, Philip Guy, who was actually a British archaeologist who was already working in Palestine at that time, he was hired to be the next director of the excavations. And then in 1935 to 39, Gordon Loud took over. He'd already been excavating at Khorsabad. So you see how you had different people with different kinds of levels of experience, and they all brought their own particular contributions to the approaches to the archaeology of that site. And also that's actually led to a number of difficulties in interpreting the archaeological remains and also publishing those remains. As we'll see, the most recent publication for the Oriental Institute from Megiddo, Stratum 6, the Iron One city, was only published in 2004 after a very long period of time. So you can see how sometimes it can take a long time. Then the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the early 1960s through to the 70s, excavated by Yigal Yadin. And that was 4 seasons, but those excavations were very, very important for providing new information and refinement of the stratigraphy and new interpretations of the biblical history of the site. But then even later on in the 1990s, from 1994 onwards, we've had Tel Aviv University working at Megiddo, re-excavating, excavating new areas. I was just speaking with Hannah, our projectionist, who tells me that she goes out there and digs at Megiddo in the summer. So it's great to have some people here who, has anyone else dug at Megiddo? It's actually a very popular site for people to just go and become a volunteer. So Israel Finkelstein, David Usishkin, Baruch Halpern, and more recently Eric Cline of George Washington University in the States have been excavating Megiddo. Of course, the excavations at Megiddo really couldn't have happened without money. At that point, of course, this was in the late 1920s, early 1930s. We're dealing with Wall Street crash, things like that. The Oriental Institute was had already been formed for about 10 years, and Breasted was very keen to have these expeditions to represent the different regions, of course, of the Middle East that he was focusing on. And he was very interested in engaging his sponsors and supporters. So John D. Rockefeller Jr., you can see him, I believe that's him there, just next to James Henry Breasted, and members of his family as well are here visiting Megiddo in 1929. It was also around this time that Rockefeller gave the money gave the funds in order to build the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, where many of the finds from the Megiddo excavations, the other half, as it were, of what we have here at the Oriental Institute, can be seen today. They're exhibited today in the Rockefeller Museum, the old Palestine Archaeological Museum. So this is just a map showing you the main areas that were excavated in this time in the 1920s and 30s. And you can see these area here, this is Schumacher's trench here. So you can see the impact that trench, just 2 seasons of excavations had on the site. And you can see this is actually, you can see that hole going right through there. That's the trench. This is a very wide trench. Of course, it was widened and also deepened somewhat by the University of Chicago and later archaeologists as well. But there's whole areas of the site that are just gone because they've been excavated and removed. And you can see the scale of these excavations as well. What allowed people to do excavations of this kind of scale, dealing with, say, 200 workmen at a time? And you're thinking about all these, the architects and the draftspersons and the people managing these teams of workmen must have been very, very difficult to keep track of what was going on in a particular building that was being excavated at a given time. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of problems with the chronology of Megiddo, is because they were excavating these large open areas of buildings and they were losing the stratigraphic resolution to really understand the fine-tuning of the chronology. That's not to say there isn't a value in what you have. The Megiddo is still very much a type site. Provides all the main types of material that you expect in the site of this kind. But the scale of resources, over 200 workmen. Labor was cheap in those days in Palestine, and this is often called the Golden Age of Archaeology. And the reason why it was a golden age is because it could be done at very large scale with fairly limited expenses. And so in a sense, you can also argue that this is also embedded very much in sort of colonial issues, issues of exploitation of labor. But of course, it was very important. In fact, Guy and others had hired foremen and workers from Egypt to come and dig, the Kuftis from Egypt to come and dig and supervise the Palestinian workers at the site, because they were already very, very experienced archaeologists. Now let's move into actually some of the material and go through the chronology of Megiddo. And I've tried to do this chronologically from the early Bronze Age through to the Iron Age too. So I'm not going to include all the periods. I know there are Neolithic remains going back to the first farming communities at Megiddo, but we don't have much that's significant and on display from those periods. So I just want to show you first of all this very interesting paving stone. And this was found on the slope of the approach to an early Bronze Age temple dating from the Eb1, early Bronze Age 1. That's just before 3000 BC, so the last half of the 4th millennium BC. This is a time where the city-states, we really got the first city-states. We don't have writing from Megiddo at this time, but we have evidence of a very complex society, an urban society. There's a great city wall around the site. In fact, I think the next slide shows, this is, I think, even from Schumacher's excavations, perhaps, this huge city wall, meters wide here, that surrounded the city. And there's this round circular cultic platform, which was presumably used for animal sacrifices in the early Bronze Age. But just going back to this paving slab, so on the approach in Schumacher's Trench, if you look, you can still see those paving slabs today. They kind of slope up towards this twin temple here that had a kind of courtyard in its approach. And this is very similar to the slightly earlier Chalcolithic broadroom temples you see at places like En-Gedi in the Jordan Valley. So there seems to be a continued tradition in the use of these types of temples, very small temples. But what's interesting is these paving slabs with the incised animals carved on some of them. And these are often wild animals. And interestingly, they include animals such as this ibex, which seems to mirror types of animals that are known really in parts of southern Egypt. And this has actually been and there's other evidence of Egyptian connections in the Eb1. There are sites that have Egyptian pottery, locally made Egyptian pottery, and also there are certain labels and inscriptions that seem to show that there are close connections with Egypt at this time. And even a part of one of these pallets, like the Nama pallet, part of a pallet has been found at nearby Beit Yerak, which is Khirbet Kerak. So there were some close connections with Egypt at this time. And so we don't really know quite what the meaning of this is and why it's here, but it does seem to indicate there was some kind of connection with Egypt at this time. But that was fairly short-lived. And in the EB2 to 3 periods, we have a region where Egypt is not really involved as much. But the region seems to have been certainly exporting a lot of produce, oil, and special goods to Egypt, and it was probably getting quite rich as a result of that. But at the end of that period, there was a lot of climatic issues. There was droughts and also flooding, and there were, for some reason or another, we don't know, could have been successive drought. Most of the cities were abandoned around 2350 BC. And then you have this period called the Intermediate Bronze Age, Eb4, where you really get, there's very little in the way of city dwelling. It seems to be a time of small farmsteads and nomadic lifestyles. And so we do have evidence of use, especially of tombs in the Eb4 period, but not so much, it's not, there were certainly farmsteads and some evidence of settlement, but not as much as the earlier Bronze Age. Now we're going into the Middle Bronze Age period, and we're seeing now the resurgence of the urban centers and the city-states again. This is a very famous tomb painting from Beni Hasan in Egypt, and what it shows is really how the Egyptians viewed the Canaanites at that time, the Asiatics, who were bringing, in this case, they're bringing themselves, but also it's like they're bringing gifts to the owner of the tomb in this particular depiction, which dates from around the 20th century BC, 12th dynasty in Egypt. So you can see here, this is how the Egyptians saw the Canaanites. You can see the different types of hairstyles, the colorful garments that were being worn, and very little evidence of this physically exists within the Levant itself, and we don't have much in the way of textual sources either that tell us about this particular period, except really from Egypt. But of course, we know in the Bible there's also the Old Testament, and talks about Joseph and his coat of many colors, and many people have drawn parallels between this particular period and the patriarchal period and period of Joseph. At Megiddo in the Middle Bronze Age, we see a very complex and a very advanced and wealthy society. There are very large houses in some of the areas, and some of these buildings here, these houses have been described as being patrician houses. There's also some suggestion that there was a great movement of people in the Middle Bronze Age, certainly from Syria down into the southern Levant. And there are lots of influences in architecture, in material culture, and sometimes in burial customs too, that seem to indicate this. But there's lots of evidence for continuity from the early Bronze Age as well. So you can't say that this is all to do with new peoples coming in, but there is certainly a degree of this with things like architectural styles. And we see here, this is an example of one of these shaft tombs at Megiddo. They're cut into the living rock, into the bedrock, and they have these large chambers on each side. And these types of tombs had already been in existence in the early Bronze Age, particularly in the Eb4, that period, the Intermediate Bronze Age, and they continued to be used in the Middle Bronze Age and also in the Late Bronze Age as well, going up until 1200 BC. So there's a lot of reuse of these tombs, but at this time, particularly in the Middle Bronze Age, some of the tomb contents are very, very rich, lots of weapons, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. This is one of the execration texts from Egypt during the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate periods. So we're dealing with the height of the Middle Bronze Age and also the Hyksos dynasty in the Delta region. And there were very close ties between the Hyksos in the Delta region of Egypt and the Canaanite city-states in the Levant. That's evidenced through the types of pottery that are found at both sets of sites, the types of burial customs as well. There seem to be very, very close connections. Of course, Egypt was, the Egyptians were very, very, they had there's a lot of information about the specific city-states and the names of those city-states in these execration texts, and they were really hated. And this goes into the period of the Hyksos expulsion from Egypt around 1550 BC, where you end up, let's just have a look at some examples of some of the Middle Bronze Age materials here. So there's certainly imported materials coming in from Cyprus. You can see the Cypriot white painted vessel on the left-hand side. So already there's connections in the Middle Bronze Age, and this is the time when Cyprus is becoming quite rich in terms of mining of copper. It's a very rich copper resource. There's mining going on, and a lot of this copper is coming into the Levant at this time, along with other goods. And so this could be part of one of the engines that's driving the economic sort of recovery, I guess, of the Middle Bronze Age. But typical types of vessels include this kind of red burnished jug, which was probably used to contain some kind of perfumed oil or special oil. And then you see these daggers, and this is really interesting, these types of bronze daggers. This is quite a nice one with a stone pommel. And these are often found in tombs with burials, and sometimes they're found bent or broken. And they're found in very large numbers in this period, and many people have tried to explain this. Is this something to do with some kind of warrior identity in the Middle Bronze Age that was very prevalent within Canaan at that time? And there's lots of evidence for fortifications, very heavy earthworks that were built up. In fact, the Middle Bronze Age rampart around Megiddo was huge, and it's often these earthen ramparts with a wall on the top of them. And so does this suggest they were defending themselves against Egypt, or were they defending themselves against other kingdoms, or were they defending themselves from themselves? Because there's might be internecine conflict between city-states, but because we don't have the textual sources that tell us about what they were actually doing in this period, we were really left in the dark. But there seems to be a very strong warrior identity, at least. Then we go really into this. I mentioned the Hyksos expulsion from Egypt. That's when Pharaoh Ahmose pushed out the Hyksos from the delta region of Egypt into the Levant, and there were a number of sieges and battles, but there was a long period of conquest and partial destruction of those cities. There's a lot of debate to what extent those cities were destroyed or kept going. Was it in Egypt's best interest to destroy those Canaanite city-states? Possibly not. We don't have any, I couldn't find any examples of Canaanite cities from that period basically being destroyed or attacked by Egypt. But here's an example of a city being attacked in the reign of Meneptah, pharaoh in 13th century BC, so a few hundred years later. But it gives you a sense of the kinds of the chaos of the battle and the defeat of these Canaanite rebels in the siege of Ashkelon, at least. But the Battle of Megiddo was really a defining moment. So Egypt already had the upper hand in the Levant from 1550 BC. It pushed out the Hyksos, but obviously hadn't contained the rebellion hadn't contained the rival powers that were still potentially a threat to them, the Hittites, Amuru, and the Canaanite city-states. So we have this, we have the documentation of the Battle of Megiddo from Karnak. It was originally written down on manuscripts which don't survive today, but it's one of the most detailed accounts of a battle that's known, and it's still studied by military historians today. And this was what I mentioned, this surprise attack where Tutmosis III, he heard about this conspiracy of rebel rulers gathering at Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley, and then he mounted his attack, and he took them by surprise, and he took a very large amount of booty from Megiddo. And I'm just going to show you this example. This is a bad drawing, unfortunately, but this is from the temple of Karnak. It just gives you a sense of Tutmosis III's tribute, booty that he took from his campaigns. And one of those campaigns, of course, was the Battle of Megiddo. I'm just going to give you a list here. It says a list of the booty which His Majesty's army carried off from the town of Megiddo: 340 living prisoners and 83 hands, 2,041 horses, 191 foals, 9 stallions and colts, unknown number of colts, 1 chariot worked with gold, with a body of gold belonging to that enemy, possibly some kind of armor that was worn. 892 chariots of his wretched army total, 924. 1 fine bronze coat of mail belonging to that enemy, 1 fine bronze coat of mail belonging to the prince of Megiddo, and 200 leather coats of mail belonging to his wretched army, 502 bows, 7 poles of merry wood worked with silver of the tent of that enemy. So that's a large amount of material to take away, so effectively debilitating the enemy's ability to respond. And what continues after then is really a phase of imperial control over the region to varied degrees. But we do know there was a garrison that was later set up at Megiddo. And at other locations, we know a lot more about these in the New Kingdom, from places like Beth Shan, here where there is actually an Egyptian garrison. We know there was some kind of garrison at Megiddo as well, and there's a lot of Egyptian material there too. So we know that there was booty taken, at least in these initial, this battle and in other conquests as well. But then there was this phase of regular tribute that was coming out from Canaan at that time into Egypt. And we know about this. We see examples of the kinds of gift and tribute brought by Asiatics who are carrying these goods, oils, wines, perfumes, etc., ivory objects. And we have lists as well, and we know a lot about this from the Amarna letters, the El Amarna letters from the 14th century BC that were found at El Amarna in Egypt, which document the correspondence of the pharaohs with the other rulers in the Near East, but also the Canaanite mayors who were still within these city-states. So if there wasn't an Egyptian governor installed, or at least visiting many of these sites in the late Bronze Age. We're dealing with now the 14th, 13th centuries BC. Then there would be Canaanite governors who would be loyal to the pharaoh. And here's just an example of just these different kinds of styles. The Canaanite governors, including the one at Megiddo, Beridia is the famous one that's known from Megiddo at that particular time in the 14th century BC. They're treated very differently to the other kings, such as the king of Mitanni, or the king of Babylon, or the king of the king of Hatti, the Hittite king. They're treated as equals to the pharaoh, at least in the letters. But in the case of the Amarna letters, this is from the time of Amenophis the third and Akhenaten. That you can see that the style is completely different. At the feet of the king, my lord, my God and son, 7 times and 7 times I prostrate myself. But actually, you see, the king of Mitanni is calling him a brother, so he's treated as an equal. But the king of this Canaanite city is treated as a lesser, he's lower on the hierarchy. And you can see here are some Canaanite headmen or mayors who are visiting Egypt, and they're paying homage to the pharaoh. So now this is really interesting. The Amarna letters, they do refer specifically, Beridia from Megiddo. He writes lots of letters asking for help, and he doesn't always seem to get responses from the pharaoh. So he's writing, may the king know that since the archers have gone back, Labayu, that's of Shechem, carries out acts of hostility against me. So he's within the regions too. It shows that there's conflict already actually within the region. He carries acts of hostility against me, and that we cannot shear the wool, we cannot pass through the gate in the presence of Labayu, since he knows that you have not given me archers. Grant the king 100 garrison troops to guard the city, lest Labayu take it. So 100 troops is really not very much, really. So you're really dealing with very small-scale city-states. We don't even know if this city was very well fortified at that time. It was probably reusing the Middle Bronze Age ramparts. So you're really dealing with quite petty squabbles that were going on, and resistance and conflict between the, say, pro-Egyptian and the ones that were resisting Egyptian rule. This is an example of one of these ivory inlays from Megiddo. This one is actually it's on display in the Israel Museum now, not in the Rockefeller Museum. But it shows a Canaanite ruler sitting on this beautiful throne, and he's being brought with him. Actually, here are prisoners. They're being brought to him, naked prisoners, and he's also being brought this chariot. This might have been, again, something that was captured in battle. He's being brought lots of gifts. This is totally that kind of late Bronze Age style of gift or tribute bearing, presenting that in this very lavish way. And this is really how the late Bronze Age elites, this could well be a Canaanite ruler here with his cloth cap, were wanting to present themselves, often in this kind of Egyptianizing style. So they really wanted to identify themselves in the Egyptianizing style. Just to show you, this is the gate that Labayu could not get into. The Beridia is talking about. This is the city gate, the late Bronze Age city gate at Megiddo. It's you can see it's a kind of a postern gate, so it would have been easy to defend. So you would have this indirect access. It's built out of ashlar masonry, very, very solid blocks of stone, and it had wooden timbers between it, so that would help also to resist earthquake as well. And there's a kind of slight curve here. You can imagine there was probably an arched entrance here, similar to the ones you find at Ugarit, Hattushas, etc. So very typical of the late Bronze Age. Another thing to do with Egyptianizing influences in the Levant at this time, in the late Bronze Age, which is under this domination by Egypt. There's this really unusual thing that we find in stratum 7, which is a late Bronze Age stratum, but it's a statue fragment that dates back to the 12th dynasty, to around 1900 BC. It's the nomarch Jehuti Hotep. And you can see this is from his wall. This is from his tomb here. She shows the colossal statue here. It's actually sitting in a similar kind of position to the position that you have on this small statue. And what's so interesting, this was probably reused as a building stone or something. We don't really know, but there are a lot of these kind of heirlooms or things that are older that are turning up in Canaan, in the southern Levant, in the late Bronze Age. Are they brought from Egypt to kind of show, as kind of, to express kind of legitimacy, historical lineages, connections with the past in Egypt? We don't really know. We don't know who brought them there and why they brought them there, but some of them may have been dedicated in temples. We don't really know. There's quite a few things like that, heirlooms in the late Bronze Age in the Levant. Also in the late Bronze Age, this type of temple actually started, this style of temple, the Migdal temple, the tower temple, started in around the Middle Bronze Age, but they continue into the late Bronze Age. And the foundations show very, very thick foundations. This here you have the Holy of Holies towards the back end of these two sort of towers up here guarding the entrance. So this was a very this is the development of the temple over the late Bronze Age, different phases. Some people have said that these incense stands, these terracotta stands, this is the example in the Megiddo gallery, are actually kind of models of shrines or temples. So you can imagine this sort of tower temple with perhaps decoration around the top edge, possibly elaborations that don't survive today. But there's a possibility that we could be dealing here with representations of shrines in the form of these model, incense burners, whatever they were. Also found, we find these types of metal figurines, El and the Baal statuette. These are very difficult to pinpoint archaeologically, stratigraphically. Very little find spot information has been found, but they seem to have come from the vicinity of the late Bronze Age temple at Megiddo. So they may have been part of the dedications or possibly a favasser or kind of ritual deposition of these important statuettes. The symbol, you see El, he's the father of the gods. We don't have his name written on the statuette, but we can see from the beard that he's probably the father of the gods, and this was in the Canaanite pantheon. Baal on the right-hand side, well, we think he's Baal, the son of El. He could actually represent Resheph, who is a kind of god to prevent plague and disease and warfare, and so there's a possibility that this might not be Baal, but that's generally what's thought, that it's probably Baal. And here's some of the material. There's ceramic material from the late Bronze Age period. So starting with the earlier part of the late Bronze Age, this type of bichrome ware, which is very, very attractive, and it has this very, very short period of use. And this gets imported to a number of places, and these are imports from Cyprus. From slightly later on. So this type of base ring juglet, which may have once contained opium, some kind of drug possibly, because it's meant to represent, it's thought to represent the opium poppy. If you turn it upside down, it looks like an opium poppy. So it may have been holding medicine or drugs. This is what's called a milk bowl, very popular import from Cyprus as well in the late Bronze Age period. And then you've got local traditions such as this is actually a very famous vase called the Megiddo vase on display. It actually shows, you can't see in this photograph, the tree of life motif. This is a very common Near Eastern symbol with the goat or the ibex flanking this date palm or palm tree in the middle. So this is very, very common feature of the Canaanite repertoire. Of course, the ivories, the Megiddo ivories, very, very important. We have, of course, a very rich collection here. The other half is, as I said, in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. And here we really see a mixture of different styles from different places. And it's so eclectic. And it's very hard to you can't really underestimate the eclectic nature of this. You've got Aegean influences, so this is very much the Griffin Sphinx that you find in Aegean, like Crete and Mycenaean Greece at that time, also Tel Adaba in Egypt. There are all these, this is very much an international sort of symbol, but it's something that's very strongly connected with the Aegean region. The Hittite style plaque is very, very beautiful. It's unfortunately very weathered, but incredibly detailed. And then you have things that are much more kind of local, Levantine, Canaanite. They seem to anticipate Phoenician ivories of a couple of centuries later. And then these sort of Egypto-Canaanite or Egyptian style, it's very difficult to say whether these are really Egyptian or not, because they don't really resemble anything that's really found in Egypt. They seem to be more of a kind of interpretation of what an Egyptian ivory should look like, possibly for, it's really about this sort of cultural mixing that you get in the late Bronze Age. And there's this beautiful gaming board, of course, with the gold inlay, and it really reflects the richness, the cosmopolitan nature of the late Bronze Age at this time. But what's weird about this ivory hoard, and this isn't in any of the gallery labels, there's a really good article, if you get the chance to read it, in the journal Levant by Marion Feldman at Berkeley. And she wrote an article about the Megiddo ivories at the end of the late Bronze Age. What many people didn't know is that there was actually a cow on top of the ivories, a dead cow. Why would there be a dead cow on top of the room where the ivories was found? And so she starts to reconstruct this and say, well, okay, why were these ivories collected in the first place? Why are they so diverse? What's going on at the end of the late Bronze Age? We're not talking about 1200 BC, we're talking about going into like 1130 BC, because the Egyptian domination and occupation of the Levant continued to varying degrees, at least until around 1130 BC, but it was sort of disintegrating, and the Egyptians eventually pulled out. The last thing that we have really from Megiddo is this Ramesses VI statue base, bronze statue base, which is in the Rockefeller Museum. And this is from about 1150 BC, but there's still indications of continuation. But things may have been falling apart at that time. You're dealing with possibly sort of robber barons or people who were sort of holding on to the control at that particular period. The infrastructure may have been fading a little bit. And so you've got this collection of ivories in this room with a dead cow on top of it. So does this, Marion Feldman reconstructs this as kind of like a sacrifice, a kind of end, like a final sacrifice, maybe to sacrificing the ivory furniture or the inlays with this cow. Possibly it was the end of the phase of this particular city. Maybe it was during a siege. We don't really know. We don't really know what happened at the end, but it was a very drastic end to Megiddo at that point. It was a destruction. And then at this time we have, in the late 13th century, Israel, the Israelites are appearing on the scene in terms of the written records. The Merneptah stela in Egypt, 1209 BC, mentions Israel by name in the context of other, including Canaanite city-states, not as a place, but rather as a people, rather than a specific place. And you know, the kind of, in the 12th century BC, we see this kind of lifestyle emerging in villages in the hill country, these four-roomed houses. And really, at Megiddo at this point is not really an Israelite city. It's still continuing the tradition of the sort of post-Canaanite, or I guess you could call it. It's still showing many of the continued traditions of the late Bronze Age, but mixed in with these different other traditions of the coastal region, including Sea Peoples traditions. And so it's very difficult to reconstruct, and Harrison's done a pretty good job at this, Tim Harrison, reconstructing the Iron One city. So we don't really know who was living there, but it was still a very complex society, still quite cosmopolitan, but not really open to the great international trade that you saw in the late Bronze Age earlier on. It was a somewhat impoverished city, but still had some quite important architecture, very rich hoards of metal, this bronze hoard, lots of metal in this period. So This was not an entirely impoverished period at all. And then we're going into stratum 5, going into the late Iron 1, early Iron 2 period. This is where things start to get a little bit confusing chronologically, so please bear with me. This is really quite challenging, even for me to work out and get my head around, and let alone anyone else. And I think there's so much difficulty with trying to interpret and disentangle the chronology of Megiddo. And part of the reason for that is partly the University of Chicago excavations caused a few problems with the way that they were excavating. But also people have been arguing about the significance of particular buildings, such as this palace, Palace 6000, Palace 1723. These two structures here have been very contentious. Some people would like to place them in stratum 4, and other people would like to place them in stratum 5, such as Norma Franklin. It's really challenging, and these are the buildings that people have often associated with the reign of Solomon. You know, the Solomonic era of the 10th century BC, this great king of Israel, the united monarchy, who was able to build monument cities of this kind of scale. The big argument has been all about how do you date the 10th century archaeologically? How do you date this Solomonic era, the era from David to Solomon, so like 1000 BC to around 940 BC, that period. 925 is when Pharaoh Shoshenq comes in, destroys a lot of sites. So we know 925 is a really important watershed, but does the Iron 1 city, for example, that Harrison published, does that go to 1000 BC, or does it go to 925 BC? This is the big debate. This 75-year period is very, very contested, and it's all about how you treat the historicity of the biblical narrative. Do you take that information about Solomon and say, oh yeah, the grand building projects, they must relate to these very fancy buildings. We know the site was destroyed in stratum 5, very fiery destruction, a lot of mud brick architecture. Not all of this was stone-built architecture. So you can see some of the mud bricks that Norma was showing me. He said, look at these vitrified mud bricks. This is a really fiery destruction. There's a pillared house, which was typical of the kind of Israelite type of house. This 4-roomed house that's on the edge of the tell. This is Fisher's. This is the fragment of the Shoshenq I or Shishak inscription that was found at Megiddo and actually published by James Henry Breasted. He was the one who published this fragment. So this is a fragment of some kind of victory stela that must have been set up at Megiddo by this pharaoh after his conquests of 925 BC. That was the time of Rehoboam, so after Solomon. But which strata? It wasn't found in situ. There's a big problem. We can't identify which stratum this belonged to. Was it found in stratum 4 or 5? And this is a big problem. But it does show that there was some kind of victory stela was set up there at Megiddo. And I'm just going to show you some of this. I don't want you to get bogged down in the... You should have a handout for this, which has got this sort of simplified chronology. There's all these issues about what the strata are called. In our galleries, we're following the conventional Chicago dating. Many people now would say that that's somewhat outdated and that we should be following maybe the low chronology, which is puts a lot of things that were dated in the 10th century as being in the 9th century or even the 8th century BC. Got to remember that there are no real inscriptions at the site to tell us this was built by David, or this was built by Solomon, or this was built by Omri. There are no inscriptions. The Israelite rulers, they didn't really do inscriptions. It wasn't part of what they did. So at least apart from maybe Hezekiah in Jerusalem. So here, this is just showing the stables. Here, the southern stables, the northern stables. Palace 6000 was found below the stables, and this was the discovery of Yadin in the 1960s, and Guy had already dated the stables to Solomon, whereas Yadin and later Osishkin wanted to date the palace that was underneath to Solomon. So you can see that this was how things changed. But I just want to take you through, this is just to give you some of the examples of the contentiousness of this. The hand-burnished pottery versus the wheel-burnished. This is this whole argument about when it starts, how late it goes, how do you assign things to the 10th century versus the 9th century. I think when we talk about the 10th century, we should also say 10th/9th, because we don't really know exactly which it belongs to. This is this simplified Iron Age chronology. So things really in the Iron, you start having problems in the Iron 1 period. Where do you start your Iron 1? How late does it go? Does it go as late as 925 or 1000? If you're saying 1000, that's bringing us up to the time of David, King David. If you're doing this, Iron 2, you're saying that the Stratum 5 was a fairly, not insignificant town, but not as grand as maybe you might expect of the Solomon tradition, and a fairly short-lived one at that. Whereas the low chronology would say that most of the things that you have that are Solomonic are actually, it's in the Iron 1 period, and Solomon wasn't really there. Solomon wasn't part of the picture. So, you know, there's a lot of contention here. It's not really until 732 BC that you start to get some agreement in the dates because of the Assyrian conquest. So this is one of the reasons why Megiddo is a bit of a mess to disentangle. So open area excavation. Lots of open area excavation in the 1920s and 30s. Balloon photography developed by Philip Guy, in order to try and disentangle this mess of the architecture. And it doesn't really help, because you have to get down there right at the micro level to work out what's later than other things. So a lot of these things are really kind of floating. And there's still work being done today to try to reconstruct. But so, in a way, Guy's work with the balloon was kind of a blessing and a curse. You know, it gave this sort of scientific veneer to the whole process. And this is just a picture of the dig team at Megiddo in the 20s with Guy and his wife Yamima. And there's various other figures here, Lamon. This is Olaf Lind here. And various other people. They lived a pretty nice lifestyle in the dig house there. And this is the balloon that Guy developed. He was a bit of an engineer type person. And of course, there were various features that people wanted to associate with, say, the era of Solomon. The gateways came a bit later on in the discussion, not at the time of Guy, but in the Book of Kings, it mentions the building the walls of Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And so walls is taken to be also the gates. Notice when I go back to Norma Franklin's assessment of Megiddo Stratum 5, which may or may not be the Solomon, the actual Solomonic period, she hasn't got a wall. There's no wall in there. She doesn't see the wall as being significant. So the wall and the gates are seen as being this monumental architecture associated with these great kings. But they could also be associated with later kings too. It doesn't have to be. So many people have associated these six-chambered gates. Guy was the one who tried to associate the stable buildings with Solomon, and these were found in Stratum 4. And so here are the stables here and how they were reconstructed. And many of you may remember the Picturing the Past exhibit where we had the Solomon stable model on display. And that was really presented as being, this is the model here. So Guy writes, if we ask ourselves who at Megiddo, shortly after the defeat of the Philistines by King David, built with the help of skilled foreign masons a city with many stables, I believe that we'll find our answer in the Bible. If one reads the history of Solomon, whether in Kings or Chronicles, one is struck by the frequency with which chariots and horses crop up. So he's saying, because there are horses and chariots in the Bible in this period, therefore the stables must be Solomonic. But actually, there are horses and stables mentioned in connection with the later kings too, the Omrid dynasty as well. And that's where we're going to. Though this is this Palace 6000 found by Yadin that was found underneath the stables. So he said, well, it could only be Solomon who could have built such a grand building. Now people are even saying, well, this is actually from the reign of Omri or Ahab, the Omrid dynasty. So things are getting really confusing here, and I apologize for that. But this is the way it is. This is the way that there's still continued debates about whether things like Palace 1723 is Solomonic or Omrid, or from the dynasty of the 9th century BC. Similarly, this proto-Aeolic capital from Megiddo, which we have in the Megiddo Gallery, this comes from a building called Building 338, which is still incredibly contested in terms of its identity and what this building is, what it dates to. This is the building down here. It was excavated actually originally by Schumacher, then Fisher had a go at it, called it a Astarte temple. Guy had a go at it then, and he thought it was a Solomonic commander's house. And then later on, Herbert May thought it was a temple still. Now it's thought to be possibly at least some kind of palatial elite dwelling with a shrine inside it. But you can see this is the reconstruction of how they saw the capitals. But this is actually a picture of the building there, just on the east side of the mound there. So it's still partly extant. Still a lot of debate about what it's dating to. Most people now date it to the 9th or possibly even the 8th century BC. So it's gone from being this sort of Solomonic building, and it's gradually being, I think we need to keep our options open though, so we perhaps should be quite broad and say, 10th through to 8th centuries. It's really, really tricky to be. But many people have tried to compare the capitals, and these are often compared with the Phoenician capitals that are known in say, Assyrian reliefs, for example, in the 9th and 8th centuries BC. And Norma Franklin's written about this date palm theory that they actually represent the bases of date palms, not the tops of date palms, which is an unusual theory. I'm not sure if I completely follow it, but it's a very interesting theory that is worth exploring further. That is that the shoots actually from the base represent what you have here, and these are actually bases of columns that had then maybe wooden pillars with other capitals on top that we don't have preserved. The jury is still out on that one, but it's a very interesting theory nevertheless. The material culture of the Iron II period. There's some really nice material. This Cypro-Phoenician ware, this sort of burnished and material with the black geometric painting on it is really very attractive. Some people have written about how the Israelites were very didn't have imports, and they didn't have a very showy kind of dining sets. They had red polished and burnished pottery that was sort of imitating metal vessels. They had this very fancy stuff too. And also, we always talk about idolatry and this whole issue about cult. And here we have figurines, such as this terracotta figurine, often referred to as an Astarte figurine or Astarte plaque. This one's quite modest actually, because she's actually dressed, which is really interesting. And I wonder what, most of them are naked at that time, a little bit before as well. So it seems to be a bit of modesty going on here with this particular. We don't know what the function of these were, whether it was in household, cult, or religion. But it was a cosmopolitan lifestyle, but a fairly simple one. Megiddo four-horned altars. So this is one that's not on display. This one is on display. Very difficult to pinpoint the date of this, possibly 10th, possibly 9th centuries BC, because it was in a disturbed context. But this was probably from some kind of shrine, maybe within a house. And there were a few of these sort of cultic corners within some of the buildings at Megiddo, some of the nicer buildings. And it's quite possible that there was this more decentralized type of worship that was going on within houses. And this is really a continuation of what was happening in the late Bronze Age as well. But there were temples, of course, in the late Bronze Age. We don't really find clear evidence for temples. There's this debate about Building 338. Is it a temple? If so, does that indicate something about the theory about Jerusalem having the only main temple? So there's this whole issue about household worship, household cult, to what scale it was going on. These altars were probably used for grain offerings, possibly incense offerings, we don't know. They probably weren't put directly onto the tops of the altars themselves, but rather in some kind of bronze vessel or another vessel that would have been on top of that and rested on those horns, and then they could have burnt the offering, and the smoke going up would have been effectively the offering to the god Yahweh or any of the other gods that may have been worshipped. See again the architectural features here. Some people have said this could be a reference to architectural features, and this style goes back to the late Bronze Age as well. The horns, very holy symbols. They're often associated with sanctuary, so criminals could seek sanctuary and grab hold of one of the horns. We learn from this in the Bible. So they were very holy, and if you broke the horn off one of these altars, it was effectively no longer holy. And there are very large versions of these that have been found as well in the Iron II period. Omri, of course, we talked about Omri in these inscriptions. So we have mention of Omri in the Mesha stela, which we have a copy of in our gallery from the Moabite kingdom. As I mentioned, the Israelite kings didn't seem to leave much in the way of inscriptions themselves. So we have to use these other sources, apart from the Bible, of course, itself. We have to use these other inscriptions to reconstruct. So we know that Omri was a very powerful ruler, and at that time, what you have a situation is Moab kind of resisted the Israelites and pushed them out of Moab, and then Mesha claimed this part to add to his kingdom. And we also have mention of Omri's son and successor in Stela, but he's not mentioned by name, but it's probably Ahab. Again, here's the city. Depending on your point of view, whether Palace 1723 is belonging to Solomon or the Omrid dynasty, Finkelstein and others have assigned this to the Omrid dynasty and the fourth, stratum 4 of the excavations. In addition, Palace 6000 as well. So that's their interpretation. Also assigning those stables to Omrid or later rulers, possibly even going into the early 8th century, rulers such as Jehoash or Jeroboam II. The stables that were famously found by Guy may be even as late as that. We know that the Assyrians were very keen on horses, and they particularly liked these Cushite horses. So it's possible that there was trade in horses, and recent studies have shown how these stables really may have been used really for the very finest horses, maybe as a kind of showground for rulers who wanted to come, possibly the Assyrians who wanted to buy special horses for their armies. So there's a possibility there that could have been one of the major sources of income for the Israelite rulers at the time when they were engaging with the Assyrians. At the end of 732 BC, there's a massive invasion of Israel by the Assyrians. Tiglath-Pileser III effectively wipes out and deports a large section of the society and leaves the place pretty much empty. We're talking about 8th century BC population estimates about 17,000 in the Lower Galilee region. This is from survey evidence. 7th century is virtually no settlement evidence. We know that there was also a drastic decline in Israel here, 31,000 to... This is all based on settlement surveys. We also know from the text, Sargon II, who built Khorsabad, in Khorsabad court, reported nearly 30,000, 27,000 deported from the Kingdom of Israel. And they were resettled in parts of northeastern Syria and also in western Iran. And we also know that he also mentions the use of Samaritans, people from Samaria, to help to build his palace at Khorsabad, the walls of Khorsabad. So we know that there were Israelites who effectively were used as slave labor or forced labor by the Assyrians at that time. And then the city was turned into a provincial capital, Megiddo. And it was much more carefully set out with a series of streets and stratum 3. And there's some kind of governor's residence there. And there are legal transactions that are going on in Assyrian cuneiform script. So this is the time where you actually it's become part of an Assyrian province. Now, I can't really go into much more detail of stratum 2 and stratum 1. I think they're not quite as relevant for our galleries. And I understand that we also don't have, we have this bit of a jump into what we have from the 1st century BC/AD with the Dead Sea Scrolls display and the ossuary as well. So I don't think there's time to get into the details of this particular issue. I just wanted to show you a nice picture of Qumran that I took last year, showing one of the caves where some of these scrolls had been found, just opposite from the settlement of Qumran itself, down by the Dead Sea. So I leave it there, and thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please ask.